get a lot of repeat emails very frequently. People ask me to make videos that I made years ago, present me with Boruto theories that are all kind of the same, show me the one big plot point that's finally gonna poke a hole in all of my Naruto knowledge. But above all of those other repetitious kind of emails, I receive one kind of email more than any other type, and that's an email that has something to do with Might Guy. See, by far and away, the most common email I get, and I get this email about once a week, is an email that goes somewhere along the lines of, Might Guy could have defeated Madara if he took off his leg weights. And even you, who doesn't have an email that 700,000 people have access to, have probably heard this point made before, that Might Guy in his battle against Madara would have stood a much better chance if he had just taken off his leg weights. I mean, we all saw just how much faster Rock Lee got after he took off his leg weights, right? So if Might Guy was to undergo a proportional change, as Rock Lee did when he took off his leg weights in his battle against Gaara, wouldn't it stand to reason that Madara would have been completely outclassed in speed and taijutsu prowess, and Might Guy, with the limited amount of time he had, would have been able to finish off Madara once and for all? Well, maybe. See, it's actually kind of a complicated question with an even more complicated answer. It requires not only understanding of particle physics, but also quantum mechanics, and knowledge of a little thing known as the Lorentz factor. So could Might Guy have won in his battle against Madara while using his 8th gate if he just took off his leg weights? Well, today, that's going to be the exact question we explore, because today we're talking Might Guy was robbed. Before we get talking on whether or not Might Guy could have ended Naruto's story a lot sooner than it was supposed to end, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. So, before we move any further with today's video, I want to establish the fact that there has never been any kind of confirmation whatsoever that Might Guy wears leg weights. We've never seen Might Guy put on leg weights. We've never seen Might Guy take off leg weights. The only reason that people believe that Might Guy wears leg weights in the first place is because Rock Lee wears leg weights. And while if it was somebody like Sasuke or Naruto taking off leg weights, we wouldn't necessarily have to assume that Kakashi or Jiraiya wore leg weights. In the case of Rock Lee and Might Guy, it feels a lot safer to assume that if Rock Lee's doing something, Might Guy's probably also doing it. One, because I highly doubt that Might Guy would ever make Rock Lee do something that he himself was not doing, and two, I highly doubt that Might Guy would skip any opportunity to train. And as Might Guy, during Naruto's timeline, was multiple times established to be stronger than Rock Lee. In fact, it wouldn't even be wild to assume that Might Guy is not only wearing leg weights, but also wearing heavier leg weights than Rock Lee. Because if Might Guy, the guy who's all about training as hard as you physically can until you achieve the level of power that you believe you deserve, told his student to wear leg weights while he himself wasn't, that just wouldn't be in line with his character. So for the sake of this video, we are going to assume that he does have leg weights. But if Might Guy is wearing leg weights, how much do they weigh? Well, like I said, it's somewhat safe for us to assume that if Might Guy was wearing leg weights, they would at least be as heavy as Rock Lee's, if not heavier. So how heavy are Rock Lee's weights? Well, there's no true way to know exactly, but they are very heavy. But how heavy is very heavy? Well, several thousand pounds, and I'll tell you how we came to that calculation. See, fortunately, we get a really good look at Rock Lee dropping his weights. And since we know how tall Rock Lee is, we can calculate how high the statue that Rock Lee's standing on is. With those calculations in mind, we're able to figure out that Rock Lee dropped his ankle weights from about 16 meters up. And the anime shows that in about 1.75 seconds, those weights were on the ground. On top of this, as Rock Lee drops his weights on concrete, and we know the tensile strength of concrete, and we're able to calculate the height of the dust plume that's generated from the dropping of these weights, we're able to calculate the amount of energy necessary to create these cloud plumes. And using those calculations, conservative estimates put Rock Lee's leg weights between 4 and 10,000 pounds a piece. So if you want to highball it, say it's 10,000 pounds. If you want to lowball it, say it's 4,000 pounds. But regardless, we're talking about several thousand pounds on each leg, which means at any given point, Rock Lee is walking around with either 8 to 20,000 pounds of weight on his body. And honestly, when you consider the massive speed boost that Rock Lee gets after dropping these leg weights, a calculation that Rock Lee ends up losing a couple thousand pounds in the second half of his battle against Gaara kind of makes sense. After all, he's no longer dragging along the weight of 4 to 10 cars with him everywhere he goes. And considering the fact that his body weight is somewhere in the region of 150-ish pounds, this means that Rock Lee has quite literally gotten dozens of times lighter. Now, if you want to take that highball metric and say that Rock Lee has 10,000 8,000 pounds on each leg. And we're assuming that Might Guy, because he wears the same leg warmers and he has Rock Lee wear these weights in the first place, not only wears these leg weights, but also wears heavier leg weights, then it's safe to assume that Might Guy is also probably traipsing around with either 10,000 or more pounds on each leg at any given moment. So the question then becomes, was Might Guy hampered by his own training regimen in his battle against Madara? Did Might Guy go into this battle against Madara 20-ish thousand pounds heavier than he could have? And if he had taken off these leg weights, would he have been so fast that even Madara wouldn't have been able to keep up with him? In a sense, what we're asking here is, was Might Guy robbed? And in order to answer that question, we kind of have to talk about the fight itself between Madara and Might Guy. So let's do a quick breakdown on how that battle actually goes and how additional speed for Might Guy could have changed the result. See, at the beginning of Might Guy and Madara's fight, Might Guy opens to the 7th gate, something that Madara says is a literal insult from him, as Might Guy believes in this moment that he'll be able to fight on par with Madara with anything less than his life on the line. And in a sense, Madara is correct, because Madara is able to very easily dodge the attacks from a 7th gate guy. Now, 7th gate guy is able to land a blow on Madara that sends him flying backwards, but it also sends Might Guy flying backwards, and Rock Lee has to fly in to haul him out of his own debris, all in order to make sure that Madara's truth-seeking orbs don't find their home in Might Guy's chest. And thus Might Guy realizes that Madara was correct when he said that Might Guy opening to the 7th gate was an insult to his power. And thus Might Guy unzips his tuning vest, activates his 8th gate chakra node, and gets into the real combat. And immediately the power difference between 7th and 8th gate guy is very noticeable, as the first thing that Might Guy does in 8th gate is launch a first step air cannon compressed shot of air that blows Madara away. In fact, this first shot is so incredibly powerful that it creates a crater that Madara now exists at the bottom of. And as Might Guy floats over this crater, getting ready to shoot his second step, cracks a bone in his bicep, which makes him realize that the weight of 8th gate is incredible pain. But as Madara begins to get up and dust himself off from the speed blitz he was just on the receiving end of, Madara realizes that this 8th gate mode from Might Guy is no joke, and that Madara will need to dodge the attacks from Might Guy's fists. More specifically, Madara identifies that Might Guy was able to fire a cone of compressed air using his punches, and that Madara would need to attack the punches from these very fists, compressing that air. And thus there's kind of two ways to look at this. Either Madara is saying any and all attacks from Might Guy should be dodged, or Madara is identifying the fact that he simply just needs to avoid the actual physical contact of Might Guy's punches. That is to say that he's willing to tank the condensed air blow shots, but not the actual punches or kicks themselves. But really the most important takeaway here is that when Might Guy opened the 8th gate, he was able to speed blitz Madara. He was able to hit Madara with a blow that Madara could not dodge or block. And had he not cracked a bone in his arm and thrown himself off, he probably would have landed a second blow. And after cracking this bone in his arm, Might Guy recovers, and he begins to run circles around Madara so fast that even Madara almost can't track his movements. However, Madara can track his movements. And therefore, when Might Guy breaks out of this circle to launch another first step, Madara actually blocks it with a True Seeker Orb. However, Madara is immediately hit with a second and third step, two additional strikes of compressed air that keep Madara locked in place. But in this moment, Madara takes all of his True Seeker Orbs and begins to wrap himself up in a defensive layer. And there's probably nothing that Might Guy could have done about this defensive layer. True Seeker Orbs are ridiculously broken, and try as he wanted to, Might Guy probably wouldn't have been able to break through them with any real force that could have hurt Madara on the other end. So I'm not saying that Might Guy couldn't have broken through a Truth Seeker Orb layer. He does in this fight, pretty much immediately after Madara wraps himself up in a Truth Seeker Orb. But the power that Might Guy would have lost to break through that Truth Seeker Orb in the first place would have meant that the punch he delivered to Madara would have had a ton less energy. Considering the fact that Might Guy was struggling to hurt Madara at all, that's probably not an advantageous situation. Therefore, after Madara wraps himself up in a True Seeker Orb to defend himself from all of these compressed shots of air, the combo team of Kakashi, Rock Lee, Gaara, and Minato all work together to 1. Teleport a part of that True Seeker Orb that's protecting Madara away, and 2. Make sure that the True Seeker Orbs that are aimed at Might Guy end up hitting Minato, who uses Flying Raijin to teleport those True Seeker Orbs away from the battle. And thus, in this moment, without the additional help of 4 very powerful combatants, Might Guy probably would have lost right then and there. Not only was Madara being defended, but there was also True Seeker Orbs that absolutely would have killed Might Guy hurtling towards him. And right here is one of those moments where you could possibly make the argument that if Might Guy was faster, he would have either been able to get to Madara before he was able to defend himself, or he would have just been able to dodge the True Seeker Orbs. And thus, maybe if Might Guy was faster, he wouldn't have needed the additional help of these 4 others. Or these 4 could have focused more on an offensive counterattack rather than focusing more on defending Might Guy. However, because the coalition of future, past, present Kage, and Rock Lee worked work together to defend Might Guy was able to land a punch on Madara inside of his Truth Seeker orb. Kind of like Sasuke and Gaara in the Chunin exams. And Madara is absolutely rocked by this full-powered punch. Now, this is only one of 2 times that Might Guy comes into real physical contact with Madara during their fight. And in both of the circumstances where Might Guy came into real physical contact with Madara were the only real times during their fight that Madara took on any true damage. As Might Guy's punch that he delivered into Madara inside of his Truth Seeker orb was so incredibly powerful that Might Guy was able to punch Madara out of the back of said Truth Seeker orb. However, this punch still does a fairly minimal amount of damage to Madara. Not only does Madara have a healing factor that probably could have got rid of the damage from this punch in a matter of moments, but all the damage done by Might Guy through this punch is surface level at best. But that's not a great sign. That means the second hardest that Might Guy could possibly hit Madara wasn't really enough to do all that much damage to it. Now, if Might Guy was able to deliver a continuous stream of blows at this level, there is a fair chance that eventually Madara would accumulate enough damage that would eventually lead to Madara's death. But the amount of damage that Madara incurs from this one punch from Might Guy is comparable to the level of damage that Meruem receives from Netero's Zero Hand. That is to say, not that much. However, fortunately for Might Guy, the next time that he would come into contact with Madara would do a fair amount of damage. As the only real time that Might Guy ever did an acknowledgeable amount of damage to Madara was with Night Guy. Might Guy's ultimate move, a technique so incredibly powerful that it took up all of his remaining life force. And thus in the moment that Madara recovers from being punched out of his Truth Seeker orb, he stands there and acknowledges Might Guy's strength. And in this moment, Might Guy realizes that he needs to put his entire life into one kick. And that one kick is Night Guy. And therefore as Might Guy hits his runner's pose and yells, "Rush!" Actually, I think he yells flow. Might Guy launches the Night Guy kick at Madara, a kick with so much speed that even Madara acknowledges that it's fast. And therefore, as Madara goes to block this attack, he realizes that Might Guy is bending space-time with this attack. And thus, Madara can't block this attack and is thus summarily kicked squarely in his chest. So what does any of this mean? This is effectively the end of the fight, as we all know, as Might Guy turns to ashes after this, and Madara, while he has a huge hole kicked in his chest, just regenerates it basically immediately. Well, there's a couple of key things that we can take from this moment. One, in this moment, Madara acknowledges the fact that Might Guy is fast. So fast that Madara isn't able to figure out a way to block his attack, and thus Madara is essentially being speed blitzed. Now, one of the more logical questions to ask here is, oh, well then what would happen if Might Guy was even faster? Well, does that really matter? See, when trying to figure out the kinetic energy of an object, and in this case the object is Might Guy, the formula is incredibly simple, or 0.5 mv squared. So that is to say, in order to figure out the kinetic energy of an object, and therefore how much energy it's going to impart upon the thing that it hits, you have to, 1, take the velocity of that object, square it, and then multiply that velocity number. Let's say Might Guy was moving at 2 meters per second, which is how you measure velocity, meters per second. His new velocity value after being squared would be 4. Let's say that Might Guy weighs 1 kilogram, because that's what mass is measured in, kilograms. That would mean his mass times his velocity squared would be 4. Now we times that by half, and we would know that his kinetic energy is 2. But 2 what? 2 kilojoules. Now, rather interestingly, if we were to add 20,000 pounds to Might Guy's weight, his M value, or his mass, would be substantially higher, right? Which would mean that the kinetic energy we get should also lead to a higher kg rating, right? Well, no, not necessarily. See, because if we're assuming that Might Guy is going to move faster proportional to the amount of weight that he loses by dropping his leg weights, then while his velocity would get higher, his mass would get lower. Now, this isn't exactly a 1-to-1 comparison, however, because remember, in the kinetic energy formula, velocity is squared, mass isn't. So the change isn't necessarily 1-to-1 proportional, assuming that losing a proportional amount of weight makes you proportionally faster, that is. But there's really no way for us to calculate any of this accurately. So really, the only important takeaway here is that if you lose mass but gain velocity, your kinetic energy can be about the same. It's much easier to stop a car going 100 miles an hour than a freight train going 15 miles an hour. And that's because the freight train and its ridiculous mass have an insane amount of kinetic energy. So what does this mean? Does this mean that Might Guy was robbed? Should he have taken off his leg weights? I mean, Nick, you just said that velocity is squared in the kinetic energy formula. So if Might Guy was able to get as fast as he did get light in a 1-to-1 proportional sense, then shouldn't he have carried more kinetic energy into this kick and therefore maybe killed Madara? Maybe. However, there is another really important moment that occurs while Might Guy is kicking Madara. And that's that Madara, while he's trying to block this incoming Night Guy attack, realizes that space-time is bending. How did Might Guy bend space-time here? Was he using Kamui? Was Kakashi helping him from behind like he does for the rest of Might Guy's life, if you know what I mean? No, it actually has nothing to do with Kakashi and everything to do with Might Guy and how fast he's moving. There's actually an argument to be made here that Night Guy is the fastest move that we ever see happen during Naruto.
But why, Nick? Haven't you said that Naruto dodges a photon laser beam in base and therefore he's way FTL plus?
Yes, I have. But this moment right here from Might Guy bending space-time with Night Guy is one of the most accurate depictions we've ever gotten in anime of what would happen if a mass was traveling at the speed of light, or relativistic speeds. See, because in physics, there's something known as the Lorentz factor. See, the Lorentz factor, and I'm gonna read this because I believe the internet does a much better job explaining it than I ever could, is a dimensionless quantity expressing how much the measurement of time, length, and other physical properties change for an object while it moves. See, what some of you may not know is that if an object with mass begins traveling at near the speed of light or at the speed of light, it will gain infinite mass. I weigh about 165 to 170 pounds, depending on how many burritos I've had in a given day. However, my mass can change depending on how fast I'm moving. While I'm sitting here in my office, the gravitational pull of the Earth makes me weigh 165 pounds. However, if I was to be propelled to the speed of light, in order to calculate things like my current mass, you would have to use the Lorentz factor. Now, the Lorentz factor formula is pretty simple, like the kinetic energy formula. Is the Lorentz factor equals 1 over the square root of 1 minus v squared over c squared. And for those of you who happen to be big Albert Einstein fans, you'll know that c stands for the speed of light. And for those of you who are paying attention during my kinetic energy bit, you'll know that v stands for velocity. And thus this equation is the Lorentz factor equals 1 over the square root of 1 minus the velocity of an object squared over the speed of light squared. So for all the mathematicians in the crowd, what happens when your speed equals the speed of light? Well, that would mean that v equals c. And what happens when you divide something by itself? You get 1. So in this equation, if a mass was traveling at the speed of light, you would get the square root of 1 minus 1, which is 0, and you would be trying to divide 1 by 0. Now, if you try and do that on your calculator right now, it'll tell you it's impossible, because it is. Anything divided by 0 is infinite. And therefore, if an object is traveling at the speed of light, if you times its mass by an infinite Lorentz factor, the mass of that object becomes infinite. Now, this is why when you see people do things like simulations, like sending a grain of sand into the earth at 99.99% the speed of light, they only ever do 99.99% the speed of light. Because if any mass travels at the speed of light into any objects, it will obliterate it, as regardless of the mass of that object, it now has infinite mass. But why are we talking about the Lorentz factor and infinite mass? Well, because the only things in the universe that bend space-time are ultra-massive objects. See, Einstein equated the universe to a blanket held at all four corners by different people. Let's say hypothetically you throw a bowling ball into the center of that blanket. That blanket is space-time, and that bowling ball is the sun. The more massive the bowling ball, the more that blanket is going to get pulled towards that object. And anything you throw towards that object is going to revolve around it until eventually it crashes into it. This is how celestial bodies have gravity, by bending that flat sheet of space-time. Now, while technically any mass has the ability to distort space-time, I distort space-time, this bottle distorts space-time, my phone, the only things in the entire universe that have the ability to visually distort space-time are things like suns, black holes, and ultra-massive planets. And thus the reason that Might Guy was able to bend space-time when coming in with his Night Guy kick to kick Madara squarely in the chest was because he was reaching relativistic speeds. And because he was traveling at these relativistic speeds, he was slowly but surely becoming an object of infinite mass, comparable to that of a black hole, a sun, or an ultra-massive planet. And as Might Guy is the only person that we've ever seen bend space-time as a mass traveling at relativistic speeds in Naruto, there is technically an argument to be made here that this is the only time that a character in Naruto has traveled at relativistic speeds. As every other time that Naruto, Sakura, Kakashi, or any of the other FTL or FTL plus characters in Naruto did an FTL feat, they didn't bend space-time. So maybe they were traveling slower than Might Guy was in the moment of his Night Guy kick. Now, that's not the situation at all. It's just that this is the one moment that Kishimoto decided to remember the applied rules of physics, and therefore as Might Guy hurtled towards Madara at relativistic speeds, he was able to bend space-time. But why are we talking about any of this? Well, the answer is rather simple. if Might Guy was able to propel himself with Night Guy at Madara at relativistic speeds, such that he was able to bend space-time and approach infinite mass, an extra 20,000 pounds is an infinitesimally small amount of mass. In fact, an extra 20,000 pounds would be considered next to nothing. It is an ignorable amount of weight to add on to a essentially solar system flying at Madara. Planets affect the fabric of space-time, and our planet, which is a very small planet, mind you, weighs 5.972 times 10 to the 24 kilograms. That's 24 zeros, as opposed to the 4 that come along with 20,000 pounds. If we assume in this moment that Might Guy was carrying a mass proportional to that of our Earth, that'd be like comparing our Earth to the weight of 10 cars. And thus in the kinetic energy formulation that you're trying to figure out for Might Guy as he kicks Madara in the chest, feeling the need to add in another 20, 30, 40, 100,000 pounds would make next to no difference. But would it make a difference from the perspective of Might Guy's velocity? I mean, what if Might Guy was able to surpass the speed of light without those leg weights on? Well, maybe. But once again, if Might Guy has the ability to propel himself and his leg weights to relativistic speeds and maintain those speeds under the power of his own body with an almost infinite mass, then once again, the difference of those 20, 30, 40,000 pounds would make a negligible difference in his velocity. Therefore, in actuality, Night Guy probably wouldn't have gotten any faster without Might Guy's leg weights, and the difference in inertia delivered by Night Guy with the leg weights is also negligible. So as to say that the weights on Might Guy's legs weren't enough to increase his inertia, and the lack thereof of those weights wasn't enough to increase his speed. So in actuality, the Chekhov's leg weights that exist on Might Guy under those leg warmers don't matter, as they wouldn't have impacted the income of the Night Guy's kick at all. But some of you might be saying, but Nick, what if Might Guy was faster for the entire fight, not just Night Guy? Sure, he bent space-time and gained nearly infinite mass in that one kick, but you yourself said earlier the only times that he was ever able to impart any actual damage on Madara is when he came into actual contact with him. And to that I say, Might Guy landed almost every single one of the blows he wanted to in his battle against Madara. In fact, over the course of Madara and Might Guy's fight, Madara only blocks one attack from Might Guy, which is his first step from the second round of air cannon blasts Might Guy sends at it. Sure, maybe if Might Guy was a little bit faster, he wouldn't have relied on his compressed air and he would have just jumped Madara, but we don't know that. On top of that, like I established earlier, nothing that Might Guy tried to use prior to Night Guy did what could be identified as a deadly amount of damage. And thus ultimately the answer for this question of what would have happened if Might Guy didn't wear his leg weights in the battle against Madara lies with what Kakashi says while watching this fight. As when Kakashi watches Might Guy activate the 8 gates, he says that Might Guy is now tens of times stronger than the Kage. All people who individually wouldn't even blink at the idea of an additional 20,000 pounds. Mass and velocity are in constant flux. It's harder to move a massive object fast, but it's easier to move a smaller object fast. That's why handguns that fire 9mm rounds can fit in your hand, while railguns that fire bullets the size of this water bottle have to be placed on warships. Whatever Might Guy made up for in velocity, he would have lost in mass, and thus the kinetic energy that he delivered to Madara would have been somewhere in the region of the same. And while yes, you can absolutely make the argument that if Might Guy was moving faster and therefore closer to the speed of light for the entirety of his battle against Madara, therefore prior to using Night Guy was approaching an infinite mass every single time he punched Madara, he probably, yes, would have done more damage. Madara is also a light speed character, and thus while Madara was hit by Might Guy's first light speed attack, if Might Guy was going light speed the entire time in his battle against Madara, Madara probably would have been hit by the first time that Might Guy striked him, but Madara most likely would have adjusted. So was Might Guy robbed? I don't think so. At least from the perspective of, oh, if he took his leg weights off, he would have won. Now, if you want to talk about Kishimoto doing him dirty and the fact that Might Guy deserved to defeat Madara literally more than anybody else, we can have that conversation. The additional 20 or so thousand pounds on Might Guy's legs were not the differentiating factor here. But I'm not a professional physicist, and some of you might know better than me. Thus, I'm curious to hear from you guys. Do you believe if Might Guy truly was wearing his leg weights throughout the entirety of his fight against Madara, and if he took them off, that he could have came out with the W? Let me know in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go react to a Scooby-Doo movie.